So I guess I'll go ahead and get started. So hopefully this will work. My screen is not advancing. There we go. Hopefully y'all can see this right. Got a little complicated trying to share two different screens here, but anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Audrey Albrecht. I'm a shorebird biologist here at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation on Sanibel, Florida. You can probably figure I like shorebirds a lot. So I recently did a walk for World Shorebird Day and we had an overwhelming response. So we decided to do another event. So today we're going to talk a little bit about identifying shorebirds on Sanibel and do a couple guided walks. Today's presentation is in a webinar format, so we cannot see or hear you. I actually somehow screwed up my screen, so I can't see myself either. So if there's something going horribly wrong, just type it in the chat and I'll get the message. Questions can be entered. You can enter them anytime, but I won't get to them till the end, but you can enter them in the Q&A feature. So if you look at your controls, you'll see a little Q&A. You can type a question in there and I'll try to answer them all today. If I don't get to your question, you can email me at shorebirds@sccf.org. I'll put that up again at the end of the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. Okay, I'm getting a message that my audio is very crackly. Are other people hearing that as well? Okay. Oh, so other people are saying it is crackly as well. Some people can hear me fine. Let's see if I can move my headphones a little. I put my headphones on because I'm doing this presentation from home today and I do have two dogs who may start barking if they see a squirrel. So I was trying to block them out. Sounds like for most people, they can hear me okay. If it's really, really bad, just go ahead and type that in the chat and I'll try taking the headphones off and we'll risk my dogs barking. So we will offer this presentation again in the spring with some more walks and it should be fun. We'll see different birds coming through for spring migration versus fall. For the guided walks next week, I will email you a few days prior to the walks to confirm who's coming, discuss the logistics, and give you my work cell phone number so you can reach me if you need me. So the agenda for today, we're going to go over methods for shorebird identification. So it's not quite as easy for those little songbirds like cardinals and warblers. You can't just use color. So we are going to rely on other things such as size, shape, behavior, their vocalizations, field marks, habitat, time of year. All of these things can help lead you to a correct identification. So we're going to go over the most common species that are observed here and those that are easily confused with one another. We will also go over a couple of the common seabirds because it is migration and we have tons of birds around right now. We're probably going to run into some of those guys out on the beach next week, or if you're out on the beach yourself, you're going to see big flocks of them. So I'll go over some of the more common ones, but gull and tern identification can be really tricky. So that's really going to be a whole separate presentation. We started to do that presentation last year and it got canceled because of COVID. So I'm hoping to reschedule that soon. This is a really good start for shorebird identification using silhouettes. It really helps you focus on the shape and size. This particular image is from the inside of the Beginner's Guide to Shorebirds by Donald and Lillian Stokes. Since I can't see myself, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it's this real small book. You can get it at like the Ding bookshop or any of the bookstores on the island, and it has these great silhouettes inside. They're really helpful to help you focus on size and shape instead of worrying about color or plumage. And I did ask Donald and Lillian if I could use this, and they did say yes. So I just circled here or put squares around the ones that we'll be talking about today. So some of the common species, what's really helpful with shorebirds is to learn some of the common and easily identifiable species first, and then you can use them as a basis of comparison for others. So the most common ones we see here include sanderlings, ruddy turnstones, willets, and black-bellied plovers. And all of those are featured in this picture here. There's also a red knot, which I wish was more common, but unfortunately they're a threatened species. So field marks are things you can use to identify birds besides just color. So a really good thing, again, I don't know if y'all can see this, but the Sibley guide, a lot of people really like Sibleys because they use drawings instead of pictures. And the reason that's important is it helps you focus on those field marks instead of just color or looking at a photo to see if it matches the bird you're looking at. When you start looking at these kind of things, it's very helpful. So I've used here a short-billed dowitcher and a red knot as examples. And in the top photo, there's a red knot on the left and a short-billed dowitcher on the right. The red knot has these little markings on its flanks, on its sides, called, we refer to them as chevrons, but they're basically little half triangles. Those are a little more prominent on the knot because normally using their bill length would be the easiest way to identify them. But as you can see in this picture, when their heads are tucked in, that's not so helpful. In the bottom left photo, I have an arrow pointing at the supercilium. It's basically a fancy word for an eyebrow. On the dowitchers, again, the bill would normally be a more helpful marker, but because it's obscured in this view, you're going to use that like stronger eye stripe as a more prominent field mark to identify. In the bottom right photo, I have an arrow pointing at the tail on the dowitcher, which is on the left. The red knot's in the back right corner, and it has a much more black and white barred tail. So you can use a bunch of these clues if the birds are not being cooperative and they're just laying there and hiding their faces. There are other things you can use to help identify. Another good method, behavior. So foraging methods are a type of behavior that can help us tell birds apart. A really big difference between sandpiper species and plover species is the way that they forage. And most of the sandpiper species are constantly moving. People compare them to like a drill or a sewing machine. They're just constantly running, constantly probing for food. Versus plovers who do a more stop-start motion with a rapid probing. Sorry, the rapid probing is the sandpipers. They do the foot trembling for plovers, excuse me. And there's other behaviors like that stick out in my mind. So when I went on the North Dakota website describing godwits a few years back to come up with ideas of how to describe them, they mentioned that they are not afraid to get wet. And shortly after I read that, I saw this bird over at Bunch Beach totally plunging its entire head into the water. So that's kind of something that stuck with me. I find if you can pick a certain feature or characteristic of birds that will help you remember, it might stick with you like that one sticks with me. Hopefully this will work. Okay, hopefully you all can see this and hopefully it will play. This is a semi-pomaded plover exhibiting that foot trembling behavior. Please excuse my shaky videography here, but basically they shake one of their feet. They do this in the sand and in the mud. Some people debate about whether the shaking attracts the worms towards them so they can eat them, or whether the shaking, especially in the muddy substrate, just loosens it up so they can see the worms. Because they're visual foragers, they're looking for the actual food item. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this video. I hope you all can see it and hopefully it will play. Okay, somebody on here is saying they have co-host on their screen. Is that normal? Jenny's on here somewhere and hopefully she can address that question. So foraging methods for sandpipers versus plovers, like I was just talking about, sandpipers are constantly running around. So this is a typical scene during fall migration when there's a lot of rack on the beach. So the sandpiper species are all running around, constantly moving. I'll play that again. Whereas we have one big black-bellied plover right in the front center, exhibiting a perfect stop-start and visually looking for food, whereas all the sandpipers are constantly probing. And in the back corner, might be able to see it. In the back left corner, there's a small piping plover. He has little orange legs. He's kind of by himself. He is showing that plover type motion where they're stopping and starting a lot. Okay, so now we will go over a bunch of the species you might expect to see here. So I apologize for those of you that are, not here around Sanibel right now, but I'm focusing on the ones we see here in the winter, during the fall and winter. So first one I want to talk about is a piping plover. This is They are not listed in any particular order, but if they were, this is actually my favorite bird. But they are listed in alphabetical order by Latin name. So piping plovers are a federally threatened species. The Great Lakes population is actually endangered. We get birds from all of the populations here. We get a lot of banded birds. If you're over at Bunch Beach, you'll see a lot of them. So we get them from the Great Lakes population, the Great Plains, the Atlantic coast, all of them. So we do have endangered and threatened ones here. Plovers in general, like these, tend to be a little more solitary. You might see a group of a dozen or so at Bunch feeding in the same area, but they're definitely not flock birds like the Sandpipers. So things they can be easily mixed up with. So semi-palmated plovers, we'll go over in a minute, but they're a very similar species. They're a little bit smaller and they're more of a darker brown color. So that helps set them apart, but otherwise they are very similar. They both have orange legs and the orange bill during the breeding season. The bottom left is with a Sanderling. I personally don't think they look a whole lot alike, but people do mix them up. But again, a Sanderling, you're going to use behavior. Like generally, you're going to see them in more of a flock type situation. In this instance, they were laying down next to each other. But as you can see, the bill length is a lot longer on the Sandpiper or the Sanderling versus on the Plover. So probably the most commonly confused one is going to be a snowy plover. So on the right-hand side, you can see a piping plover on the left of that image with the orange legs, and the snowy plover on the right has gray legs. So they're very similar in their non-breeding plumage when they both lose that black collar, but the real distinguishing factor will be that leg color. So snowy plovers. Hopefully you all know snowy plovers. They nest here on Sanibel. SCCF is just coming up on our 20th anniversary of our snowy plover monitoring project. In recent years, we only have about 4 to 5 pairs nesting here on the island, but they're doing surprisingly okay and managing to still fledge chicks despite all of the threats against them. So on the left-hand side, there's actually 2 photos of the same bird. So the top one is Blue. She's one of our banded birds. That's her in her breeding plumage. And on the lower left, she is in her non-breeding plumage where she loses that black brow, the black eye spot, and the black collar. On the right, I'm not going to go too much into detail about, juveniles versus adults or males versus females for most of the species today. There's that could be a whole other talk. So when I was making this presentation, I realized there's just a whole lot more than I can fit into an hour. So if there's anything that really interests you all, like identifying juveniles or identifying males versus females or our nesting species, send me an email or put it in the chat and let me know, and we could try to put together some other presentations that go a little more in depth. So birds that our snowy plover can be mixed up with, we already talked about the piping plover. I hear a lot of people confusing them with Sanderlings. They'll come up and they'll tell me, oh, I just saw 100 snowy plovers on the beach. And I'm like, well, you probably didn't. So we don't have that many snowy plovers, but we do have that many Sanderlings. So again, looking at a Sanderling, which is a type of sandpiper, versus the plover, the bill is a lot longer and they lack that. Well, in the non-breeding season, I guess that's less helpful, but during the breeding season, the snowy plovers will have that black brow and black collar that set them apart. The photo on the left is a little challenging. So those are both snowy plovers on the left, and this is a good instance to use field marks instead of color because there is some variation in the color. That one in the middle is a darker brown one than we typically see here, but it still has that characteristic thin bill. So next up on the plover list is the semi-palmated plover. We saw a picture of this earlier next to the piping plover, but these guys nest up in Arctic Canada and they come down here for the fall and winter. So they are much darker brown than either the snowy or the piping plover. They have an orange bill, orange legs. They are a bit more of a flock bird than your usual plover. So these guys, if you're seeing them from a distance and you're having a hard time telling them apart, you're going to likely see more of these. So if you're over at Bunch, you'll probably see sometimes 10 to 20 of these guys together versus the snowies and piping, which tend to be a little more individual or solitary. So species they can be mixed up with. On the left, I have one next to a Wilson's plover. So we'll get to the Wilson's plover in a second, but as you can see, the Wilson's is bigger and they have a darker bill. You can't see leg color in this picture, but they also do not have orange legs. On the right is with a snowy plover. I don't feel it's very easy to mix these two up, but some people do when they're still first learning. But as you can see, the semi-palmated plover is much darker with that black collar and black brow and the orange legs and orange bill. So Wilson's plovers, these nest here as well. We don't have quite as many as we do of our snowy plovers, but they nest here. They're much more secretive. You're less likely to see them. They like to hang out at the far west end of Bowman's Beach. Excuse me. So they have a much thicker, bigger bill, and that's because they eat different food than the other plovers. They're not really looking for worms in the sand, and they're not really catching as many insects, but they really love to eat crabs. So that photo on the right was taken at Bunch Beach. They tend to corral the fiddler crabs and eat those guys. So again, Wilson's plovers, probably most similar to semi-palmated plovers. However, they are bigger and they have a thicker bill. They can be mixed up with killdeer as well, but killdeer are a whole lot bigger. And the really easy one there is the killdeer always has the double collar instead of the single. So killdeer, they are everywhere. So it doesn't really matter where you live. You've probably seen a killdeer nesting somewhere near you. Their Latin name is Charadrius vociferus. They're very loud. You'll know it. They nest in baseball diamonds and parking lots, on rooftops, all over the place. Again, that double collar is really the best, easiest way to identify them visually, but usually you're going to hear them before you see them. The last plover we have is the black-bellied plover. Not really named that great. In other parts of the world, they call this the gray plover. Because in that bottom left photo is what they look like most of the year. They don't actually have the black belly. But the top left photo is how they got their name. So they're very striking when they're in their breeding plumage. We only see them like that in usually in like May before they migrate, or maybe August when they're coming back. The one in the middle is showing what they look like kind of in between when they're losing that plumage. They look a little bit like a Dalmatian. I've had people here on Sanibel come up and they see one for the first time with the black belly, and they tell me, I've been here 20 years and I've never seen that bird. They just didn't know what it was because it was in a different plumage. So they're pretty distinctive here among plovers. They act like plovers. They run in that stop-start motion. They have a shorter, thicker bill. They have a big round eye. But if you can't see any of that, you can usually hear them. They have a whistle-like call. They usually call out before they fly away. And also when they're in flight, that picture on the right shows that black armpit that's characteristic of these guys. Things they can be mixed up with. They really can't be mixed up with any of the other plovers here just because they're so much bigger. There are golden plovers that are similar, but I won't get into that today. We don't ever see them here, so shouldn't be a confusion. Because of their size and coloration in the winter, some people do mix them up with black-bellied plovers, but as you can see in the photos, they are much bigger. They have a thicker bill, the round eye, the stocky body, not like the Sandpiper species. So I will breeze through these couple. I'm not spending a lot of time on ones that are easy to identify. I'm trying to focus more on the ones that are hard to identify, but we have oyster catchers. Their coloration is helpful in identifying them because there's really nothing else that looks like them here, but their name says it all. They are oyster catchers. They like to catch bivalves, clams, oysters. You'll find them at Bunch Beach eating these shells, like in the photo on the top left, they're eating a sunray Venus clam. Then we have stilts and avocets. So the black-necked stilt, again, can't really be mixed up with anything else. They have, I think they're second with length of legs compared to body size. I think only the flamingo has longer legs. So they have these extensively long pink legs. They're black and white bodies, a long pointed bill. They can't really be confused with anyone. They do nest here on Sanibel, so they are here year round. The bottom left photo is actually with some stilt sandpipers, but I won't get into stilt sandpipers today because we almost never see them here. American avocets, hopefully this little video will play. They're pretty distinctive, like you can see them. They have a long upturned bill. They're usually in their wintering plumage when they're here, so they're black and white, but that long curved bill is really the dead giveaway. But If you see them from afar and you can't quite identify them, they have this kind of distinctive foraging method, which hopefully you all can see. They sweep their bill side to side, kind of like a roseate spoonbill does. Okay, so moving past all those guys, we have now our sandpipers. These are the hard ones. Luckily, our first sandpiper on the list is a spotted sandpiper. So you might think it looks a lot like other ones, but this one has a very distinctive action that will set it apart from everybody. It's constantly bobbing its tail up and down. Some people call it twerking. You're really not going to mix it up with any of the other sandpipers. They're not on the beach terribly often. They're not in large flocks. They're usually by themselves. They're usually in fresh water, or if they're in salt water, they're along the mangroves. Really, the only thing that looks like them is a solitary sandpiper, but again, we don't see very many of those. So chances are, if you see a little guy looks like this, that's bobbing its butt up and down, it's going to be a spotted sandpiper. Sorry, I seem to be losing my voice. Okay, so we have ready turnstones. These guys are one of our most numerous species, but again, they are very distinctive looking, so you're probably not going to mix them up with anyone. So appearance-wise, they have that strong black collar, and they have a pointed bill, and they have bright orange legs. But their name also is a giveaway for their behavior. So when you're watching these guys forage up north where there's more rocks, they're literally turning stones over trying to find food. Here on Sanibel, it's more likely they're turning over shells or bits of rack, or they really like those lightning whelk egg cases. They're always flipping them over looking for bugs underneath. So Sanderling, this guy is probably our most numerous. These are the little ones you see in a flock running to and from the waves. They're very cool birds. They nest in Arctic Canada and they fly all the way here. Much like some of the other Arctic nesting species, their juveniles might stay here year round. So their first year of life, they may not migrate. So people get a little confused because we do have some of them year round, but you're not going to see very many during the summer. Most of them are going to be migrating. So the top left photo shows one that's just getting ready for migration. So it has a nice cinnamon color, beautiful scaly back. Whereas on the bottom left, you can see what they look like most of the time. When they're here, they're this kind of white color. Their Latin name is a little hint too, Calidris alba, with alba meaning white. They tend to be predominantly white. So I'm going to have some slides that are going to go over similar species like I did with the plovers, but because the Sanderlings are mixed up with a lot of things, I have them kind of mixed throughout the presentation. So we'll get back to them. Dunlin are another little brown shorebird, right? So the bottom left is what they usually look like when they're here, very drab. Their behavior is a lot like the other sandpipers with the constant foraging, drilling. But what helps give them away is their long bill with this slight downturn. So people usually refer to it as a drooping bill. So compared to the other similar species, it has a much longer bill that has a slight downturn. Sometimes during migration, you'll see them with that little black circle on their belly, but usually they're almost totally molted by the time they arrive here. So just some things that look similar to Dunlin. The left image is compared to a Sanderling and a red knot. Again, the Dunlin is kind of medium sized between those two, but you can still see it has that distinctive longer drooping bill. And in the photo on the right, I asked them to pose nicely for me for my presentations, and they do sometimes. So really good side view just to compare that length of the bill compared to the length of the head. And the coloration is a little bit helpful. They are more brown, but in general, that bill is going to be the real most helpful thing for Dunlin. And red knots. So these are one of my favorites for sure. These guys, unfortunately, were recently listed in 2014 as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Their critical habitat was just designated. Actually, they just closed for public comment last month, and SCCF did contribute some comments in support of the fact that they listed all of Sanibel as critical habitat for the red knot, which is great. But we also proposed that they list North Captiva, which is another important area for these guys. So if their color was red all the time, they'd be super easy to identify. Unfortunately, usually by the time we see them here, they look more like that middle photo or the bottom left where they've completely molted. So size can be a little tricky with migratory shorebirds. something I should have mentioned earlier, but the photo on the right is a good example of, those are both red knots that have been here. So one of them had been here already. They can actually double their body weight, or just about double their body weight before migration. So they may stop over at the Delaware Bay, feast on horseshoe crab eggs or whichever way they're going, and then come back here and they are exhausted and emaciated and they're looking for food. So that one on the right is one that had just migrated and was totally starving. So just a really good comparison for size, because right during migration, size can be a less helpful attribute to look at. So things they get mixed up with, like we talked about earlier, short-billed dowagers for sure, because they're so similar in size and color. But in this photo, they're posing a little more nicely, showing that longer bill on the short-billed dowager. And you can still see that the dowagers do have that more prominent supercilium or eye stripe. People mix them up with Sanderlings a lot. I don't think because they look so much alike, but because more of their behavior. Both of these birds are flock birds that you'll see running in and out of the water's edge away from the waves. So if you're not seeing them next to each other, it can be a little tricky, but the red knots are much bigger. They have greenish yellow legs and more of a brown color, whereas the Sanderlings are smaller, whiter, and they have black legs. So another one you might see here, the Western Sandpiper. So I don't see them so much on Sanibel, but if you go over to Bunch Beach at a low tide, you'll see hundreds of these guys. So they're one of our most common sandpipers. They are smaller than the Sanderlings, which is helpful. They are more brown and they have a longer bill with a slight droop, but not nearly as long or drooping as the Dunlin's bill. The most common thing they're confused with are semi-palmated sandpipers, which I didn't feature in this presentation today because we see a lot less of them. We'll see a few during migration, but in general, we don't see a ton of them. So chances are, if you're looking at a sandpiper this size with the black legs, it's probably going to be a Western sandpiper. But just for reference, in the photo on the right, you can see the bill on the semi-palmated is much shorter. And that diagram on the left is one I found several years ago that I actually keep printed out in my clipboard when I'm in the field, because it can be a little confusing out there, but that bill length will really be the giveaway every time. Then we have least sandpipers. So these are actually the smallest shorebird in the whole world. They're very, very tiny. When they're in their breeding plumage, they look similar to Western sandpipers and Sanderlings. However, they're extremely small and they have those yellow legs. So another thing I forgot to mention, if you're trying to look for color on shorebirds, you always want to make sure you get in the best lighting. So if it's possible to do so without disturbing the birds, you can get so that you have the sun at your back, and with your scope or your camera or your binoculars, you'll be able to see the colors better. In this case, these guys are teeny tiny, but again, during migration, some of those other species might be really small too, because they're not, they've just finished migrating and they need to fatten up again before they finish their journey. So sometimes size isn't the best indicator, but in general, they are the smallest. The one on the right was one we found a couple weeks ago, sick with possible brevetoxicosis or red tide poisoning that we brought into Crow. I just put that there for size reference so you can see just how tiny they are. So the least sandpiper, again, next to a Sanderling, is teeny tiny. And the one on the right is with the semi-palmated plover, not because I think anyone would mix those two up, just for reference for how tiny they are, because semi-palmated plovers are very tiny as well. Okay, short-billed dowagers. These guys are more of a, they're another flock bird, sandpiper species. We see them a lot. There's tons of them at Bunch Beach right now. I see them a lot up at South Seas. Haven't been seeing as many on Sanibel right now, but usually there's a couple around. They do have a little bit of a cinnamon color when they're in their breeding plumage, and we'll see them look a little bit like that when they first are leaving for migration or coming back. But the bottom left is generally what they look like when they're here all winter. They can easily be confused with a long-billed dowager, but I didn't bother to include that in this presentation because we don't see long-billed dowagers here. They tend to be more associated with freshwater and more in the middle of the country. I've never seen one here that I know of. But people do compare them to willets a lot. I actually had someone come up to me the other day and point out what she thought was a baby willet. So it was actually a short-billed dowager, but in the photo on the left, you can see there's a really huge size difference between those two. And on the right is the same photo we looked at earlier next to a red knot. When you are able to get them in good lighting and spend some time looking, you can see those differences with the chevron flanks on the flanks of the red knot and the dowitcher on the right with that stronger supercilium eye stripe. Their legs tend to be a little more yellow, but that's not always a very helpful tool. Marbled godwit. These guys are nest up north into Canada, in central North America. When I worked in North Dakota, we had them nesting all over the place. Really, they don't look too much different in their breeding plumage versus their wintering plumage. They have an orange bill when they're in their breeding plumage, and it turns pink when they're down here. They have a little more streaking on the chest when they're in their breeding plumage. But in general, they don't look like a lot of other species around with that very prominent long pointed bill with the black tip. Like I said earlier too, they're quote unquote not afraid to get wet. You'll often see them with their whole head just completely submerged in the water. There are a lot of them at Bunch Beach right now. If anyone has been over there, you might have seen them. Greater yellow legs. This is one you don't see on the beach too often, but it does happen. Their name is probably the most helpful indicator. They have bright yellow legs. They do look a little bit like an upland sandpiper, but here in Sanibel and around here, we don't see a lot of upland sandpipers. So if you're seeing this brown speckly bird with yellow legs, it's most likely a yellow legs. The photo on the bottom left is next to a lesser yellow legs. We don't have as many of those, but there is a huge size difference. There's not really much to help go by when they're not, in the same area, but in general, most of what we have here are going to be greater. They're, like I said, they're not on the beach as much. They tend to be more in freshwater. You might see a lot of them at the Bailey Tract or like at the Estero Bay Preserve, places like that. Willets, again, one of our most common species. These guys are everywhere. So the top left is what they look like in their breeding plumage. It's not too much of a change, but the bottom left is what you're going to see more often here. Very drab gray. Their behavior, they're like other sandpipers. They forage constantly. They're in and out of the water. But when they fly away, they tend to scream loudly and let their presence be known or their leaving be known. And they have those real strong black and white barring on the wings that even if you don't identify them when they're on the ground, when they take off, you'll see those very prominent black and white stripes, like in that photo taken by my friend Carl. So comparing willets to other things, again, they do look a little similar to the dowitchers, but they are much bigger compared to a marbled godwit. Sometimes when they're all grouped up with their heads tucked in, it could be a little tricky, but the godwits are bigger. They have more brown on them. And if you can see their bill, you can see it's very clearly very different. And on the right, so from a distance, if you're looking through a scope from far away, you might mix up a willet with a greater yellow legs, but in general, the leg color is the did giveaway. Okay, so we have our gulls, terns, and skimmers. So if you're out on the beach right now, this is something you'll probably see a lot of, these big flocks of gulls and terns, and hopefully you're not seeing children chasing them, which is what we've been seeing a lot of. Spend a lot of time educating people. If this happens to you, you can explain to people that under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it is unlawful to harass migratory birds. Also, these guys are tired from migration. They need a break. And these guys are actually still feeding their juveniles right now. So if you can't get through to anyone with any other ways of explaining why you shouldn't be flushing them, you can explain that they're still trying to feed their babies. And every time they get flushed, that's a meal that their child misses. And that usually will get to people. So I didn't include a lot of details on these guys. Like I said, we're going to do a whole separate presentation for this topic. The laughing gull is probably the most common gull we see here. I was looking for a photo in my collection of one in breeding plumage, and the only one I had for some reason is this one on the pelican's back, but that's actually pretty good because it speaks to their behavior. This is a common behavior you'll see them engage in, harassing pelicans for food. The middle photo is generally what we see them like here most of the time. And the one on the right, I only put in here because this bird has reappeared. I think it's like the 4th or 5th year it's been around. This is called an aberrant laughing gull. It's not melanistic or leucistic, anything like that. They just refer to it as aberrant. It's missing some pigment in its unfeathered parts, is how it's been described to me. So This particular individual is hanging out by the lighthouse. If you see it and it looks like a really strange looking laughing gull, that's what that is. We also have ring-billed gulls. Their name is the most helpful indicator when they have a ring around their bill. So up north where I'm from, we call these parking lot gulls because if you go to a McDonald's, they're like on your car trying to get your French fries kind of thing. Down here, they just winter here and behave like a normal gull. I see them actually catching their own fish, which is great. We have lesser blackback gulls, which are more common than they used to be. So it used to be that we had more herring gulls here, but at some point in the last couple decades, it made a switch. We see more of these lesser blackback gulls now. The adults have a charcoal dark back with yellow bill and yellow legs. Then the herring gull is actually a lot bigger, but we see less of them now. The photo on the bottom left, again, this is going to be a whole separate talk, but the photo on the bottom left shows a herring gull on the left with a lesser blackback gull on the right, juveniles. You can see that the herring gull is much bigger. Some other gulls you might see around, we have great blackback gulls, Franklin's gulls, Bonaparte's gulls. These are all going to be dependent on the time of year. Franklin's gulls only seem to come through during migration, and Bonaparte's gulls, same, they're only here in January and February when they're migrating, and they act more like a tern. In terms of terns, we have the most common we see is the sandwich tern. So these are the kind of medium terns with the black bill with the yellow tip. And right now, you're going to see a lot of that photo on the right with the juveniles begging from the adults. Oh, I should mention, they do get kind of a pinkish color in their breeding plumage. So that bird on the right in the left-hand photo kind of depends on your screen, but you might be able to see it has a slight pink hue. Then we have royal terns. This is our probably about on par with the sandwich terns for how many we have, but royal terns are here. Right now we have large numbers of them exhibiting a lot of that behavior on the top right with the adults having to feed the juveniles. The one on the left and right are in their breeding plumage with the full black cap. Well, and in the middle photo as well, I have one in the front is in its breeding plumage, the one in the back is in its non-breeding plumage. It sort of loses some of that black cap. These guys are particularly susceptible to red tide and toxins in the water. So we have some research going on to figure out what happened last year when we had kind of a mass mortality event, or earlier this year, I should say, when if you were here, there were dead ones all over the causeway, sick ones all over the beach. So we're working with Crow and some other partners to do some research to figure out what was going on there, if it was just red tide or if there was other things at play. And black skimmers. These guys are here year round. They nest here. They're pretty distinctive. There's not really any mixing them up. Their name describes their behavior. You'll often see them if you're out at like sunrise or sunset by the lighthouse, or if you go over to Fort Myers Beach, you'll see them skimming the water for their fish. They have that long distinctive bill. There's really not too much you can mix them up with. And then just a couple other terns you might see around. We have forester's terns and common terns during migration. The forester's tern is, these are both kind of small, medium size. The forester's tern has that distinctive black eye patch, whereas the common tern has the black on the back of the neck and a dark carpal bar. So on its shoulder there, basically. Well, wrist, I guess, technically. And then we also have least terns that nest here. They're here in the summer. We have black terns that come through in migration. We have elegant terns every once in a while. Those are pretty rare. Gull-billed terns and Caspian terns. Caspian terns are more common in Florida, but we just don't see a lot down here. But as you can see in that photo, some people will send me a photo and say they saw a Caspian tern, but as you can see next to the royal tern, it's actually quite a bit bigger, and it has more black around the eye, and there is, hard to see in that photo, but there's a little bit of black tip at the end of the bill. So some of the resources I recommend for shorebirds, like I said, that Stokes guide is really good. You can fit it in your binoculars case or in your backpack. I'm partial to the Sibley guide, but these other books are really good too. I like the Crossley guide because it shows you the bird in all of its different plumages. So if anyone has this one, hopefully you can see this. It's really great because it shows it in all their different plumages. So it gives you a lot of different views. So these are the birds I keep, books I keep on my shelf for birding. You can also use apps like iNaturalist or Merlin if you're able to take a photo and like on my camera, I can send it straight to my phone and put it in the app and it'll identify it for you. And always allaboutbirds.org from the Cornell lab is great. They have just tons of photos of them and all their different plumages with like every bit of information you could possibly want. So I probably was talking too fast, or I probably forgot to say a few things I wanted. So of course, please ask me questions. You can type them in the Q&A or in the chat, or if you think of something later, just email me at this address here on the screen at shorebirds@sccf.org. So I will check the Q&A. Oh, okay. So the first question I have here, so how do the red tides occurring along Sanibel affect the different species of shorebirds? So that's a great question. Actually, kind of depends on the bird. So for the seabirds that are eating the fish, they're getting it directly from their food. So they get sick. But for shorebirds, we have things like red knots, for example, tend to prefer to eat coquina clams. And during a red tide, a lot of those coquina clams will die off. So you'll see the red knots start to just starve to death. In terms of the other shorebirds that are a little less, they're a little more opportunistic. So ruddy turnstones and sanderlings, you'll often see them foraging on the dead fish. So they'll be eating the eyes or the viscera, the organs, and getting toxins that way. So they do end up sick a lot of the time. So not real great options for our shorebirds. The ones that aren't eating are starving, and the ones that are eating are getting sick from what they're eating. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm using this Q&A feature right, so bear with me. I have another question. Okay. It says foraging method slide, which bird is which? I'm not sure exactly. Did you mean on the diagram? You can type into the chat, Diane, who asked the question, and I'll get back to that one. What time of year? Okay, so we have another question. What time of year is most productive for seeing shorebirds? So I think that fall migration is like the best time for shorebirds. So all of September and into October, there's tons of shorebirds around. If you go to Bunch Beach, especially, there's just hundreds and hundreds, thousands of shorebirds out when you go to low tide. If you want to go to Bunch Beach, make sure you use the Punta Rasa tide chart. And if you go about an hour before low tide, you can hike out across that channel on the west side and you can see a lot of really good stuff. Okay, so Wendy's asking, what months can we expect to see red knots on Sanibel? That's a great question. So generally they start showing up in late July, but I see most of them in September. And right now we're actually seeing more than I've seen in the last 2 years, which is really encouraging because I was starting to get scared. I'll try to keep this answer short, but basically after the really bad red tide in 2018, I started following banded individuals that we used to see here every year on Sanibel. And when I looked online at bandedbirds.org, I saw that those birds were still alive and still being seen. They just weren't coming back to Sanibel. So I'm really excited this fall to get out there and see how many knots we have. We're actually seeing quite a few juveniles right now, which is also really encouraging. It means they must have had a pretty good nesting year. So things are looking up for our red knots right now. Okay, good question. Yeah, I do mention Bunch Beach a lot. So before I came here, I worked in South Texas for a few years in the Laguna Madre. So I am particularly drawn to large mudflat type areas where you can see lots of shorebirds. And here, Bunch Beach is one of the closest places you can get to that at a good low tide. It's very exposed with, just like I said, thousands of shorebirds and all different types. So yeah, definitely one of my go-to places. It's on my way home, so I stop there. If I'm driving over the bridge and I see there's a good low tide, I'll call my boyfriend and ask if he can go let the dogs out, and I'll go over there. Okay, so thank you for clarifying the question about the foraging slide. I will try to, I wonder if I can go back to that one so I can try to have the image pulled up so I can see which species are on there. Okay, I underestimated how many slides I had. Sorry, guys. Or overestimated, underestimated. Okay, oh, too far. Okay, so this graphic, I think it's just meant to be generic shorebird species. The one on the top left looks a lot like it could be a red knot. The one on the right, a lot like a willet or a godwit. Lower left, maybe something like a dowitcher. And the bottom right looks like a generic plover. It has those real generic plover features, including a black collar. So I'm leaning towards like semi-palmated plover, but I hope that answers your question. When does fall migration typically end? So we're probably nearing the slowing down of fall migration, but what I find is with some species, so red knots, for example, we get a bunch of red knots moving through in September and October. And so based on banded birds that we know of, those birds that come through then seem to move on. And then there's often a little gap where we're not seeing any. And then all of a sudden, this is just my observation, but the banded birds, so we have some knots that were banded here on Sanibel in 2007 and 2006 that are still alive and still come back, and they are wintering birds. So there's some birds, like I said, red knots, they can migrate up to 9,000 miles one way. So they might go from Arctic Canada all the way to the southern tip of South America, and they might stop over here. But then we have other birds that stay here all winter. So what I see is that most of fall migration ends around October, November, but then we do get a few more birds still moving through and that come here to stay for the winter into November and December. And okay, oh, thank you. I think I answered the question right about the diagram. And in the chat, I see, are we finding birds affected by microplastics in their prey? Definitely for seabirds. So anything that's eating those small fish, they are definitely affected by microplastics for sure. And other species like turtles and stuff as well. I don't know about for shorebirds. I haven't heard anything about that for the type of invertebrates that they're eating, but that is actually a really good question. I would like to learn more about that myself. But if you're interested in microplastics and prey for seabirds, if you look up like albatross and things like that with microplastics, you'll find some horrifying presentations about birds that have been necropsied and their stomachs are almost entirely full of plastic. Okay. Oh, which bird travels the furthest to get to Sanibel for the weather? Probably any of the Arctic nesting species. So all of those ruddy turnstones, red knots, sanderlings, dowitchers, all those guys are nesting way up in Arctic Canada. And we have one individual banded sanderling that I can tell you exactly where it nests, because the researchers, when I submitted our report, showed us a picture of its nest, a picture of them banding it at its nest. So it's all the way up in Nunavut at Polar Bear Pass National Wildlife Area. It's about 3,400 miles away. So I can say for a fact that we have some birds here in the winter that have flown at least 3,400 miles to get here, and they may go on further. Okay. See if we have any more questions. Sorry, I seem to be losing my voice today. Poor timing. Oh, thank you for all the compliments, everyone. I'm sure, like I said, that I forgot some stuff, so please just email me, shorebirds@sccf.org. Anything you think of later that I might have missed or that comes up while you're out there birding. And hopefully we'll see some of you next week on the beach. I'm hoping in the spring that with the end of, I'm hoping for the end of COVID, right? So I'm hoping things are safer and we'll be able to do more events again, and maybe some larger groups. But for now, we'll just keep it to some small groups. Oh, I have a couple people from Toronto. Well, lots of our birds here are from Canada, so you might see them up there on their way down. Oh, thanks, Wendy. I think there's probably some shorebirds in Indiana. I was very surprised. I just went to, anyone who follows my Instagram probably saw, but I just went to Antelope Island State Park, which is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And there are thousands, maybe millions of shorebirds there moving through. It's absolutely incredible. And I was just there last week, so they're still there. Oh, good. Sounds like some of these birds are seen in the UK as well. Yeah, some of the Arctic nesting shorebirds have a very widespread wintering areas. So things like ruddy turnstones and sanderlings might all nest in the same area, but they spread out far and wide for their wintering areas. Okay, looks like no more questions and a bunch of people are heading out. So thank you everyone for being here today. Hope that you got something out of this. I try not to make it too technical, just trying to make it fun and easy to look at the shorebirds we have here.